I moved to Maplewood Estates for peace, a nice little suburban pocket of quiet where lawns were manicured to perfection, mailboxes stood like obedient soldiers along the curb, and neighbors smiled at each other with just the right balance of friendliness and distance. It was the kind of place where you could sip coffee on your porch without worrying about a sudden drive-by or waking up to your car window smashed in. I should have known it was too good to be true. The first sign of trouble came in the form of a crisp, cream-colored envelope tucked neatly under my front doormat. Inside, in the aggressive politeness only found in HOA notices, was a formal warning. Dear Mr. Calloway, it has come to our attention that your front yard does not meet the community aesthetic standards set forth by the Maplewood Estates Homeowners Association. Specifically, the presence of non-grass elements, such as gravel and native plants, disrupts the uniform appearance of the neighborhood. Please remove and replace these elements with approved landscaping by the end of the month to avoid further action. Best regards, Judith Delacroix, HOA President. At first, I thought it was a mistake. I had spent weeks replacing my water-hogging front lawn with an eco-friendly, drought-resistant landscape, a mix of river rocks, succulents, and a few pollinator-friendly plants. Nothing crazy, just responsible. Plenty of my neighbors had stopped by to compliment it. Even the old man across the street, who mowed his lawn 3 times a week like it was a religious practice, had begrudgingly admitted it was different, but not bad. Judith Delacroix, however, did not share that sentiment. She was the kind of woman who looked like she had been born clutching a clipboard. Her hair was the exact shade of "I'd like to speak to the manager" blonde, meticulously styled into a helmet of authority. She wore pastels and pearl necklaces with the precision of a woman who controlled everything within her domain, down to the arrangement of hors d'oeuvres at neighborhood potlucks. And she had a stare that could cut through solid steel, an expression permanently set somewhere between mild disappointment and outright contempt. I figured a reasonable conversation could settle it. That was my first mistake. "Mr. Calloway," she greeted when I knocked on her door, her voice as clipped and sharp as the edges of her perfectly hedged boxwoods. "I assume you're here about your compliance notice." "That's right," I said, forcing a friendly smile. "I think there might be some misunderstanding. My landscaping follows all city guidelines for sustainable—" She waved a manicured hand, cutting me off. "City guidelines don't apply here, Mr. Calloway. Maplewood Estates has its own set of standards. We maintain a certain look, a certain order. That was the word she clung to like a lifeline. But my yard looks fine. More than fine. A lot of neighbors have told me they like it." She smiled, an expression so devoid of warmth. It felt like the temperature dropped 5 degrees. "This isn't a democracy, Mr. Calloway. The community has expectations, and I enforce them." With that, she handed me another notice and shut the door. That's when I realized something. This wasn't just about my yacht. Judith Delacroix had found herself a new project, and that project was me. It started small. The next morning, I found another warning taped to my garage door. Then came the fines, $50 for a first violation, escalating to $100 the following week. I appealed, of course, but my requests were met with automated emails and smug form letters, and then the passive-aggressive warfare began. Mysterious complaints about my unkempt property started flooding the HOA meetings. Trash cans, accidentally, knocked over, my mail delivered to the wrong address, my car windshield splattered with suspiciously white bird droppings every morning. I tried to ignore it, tried to be the bigger person, but Judith wasn't satisfied with minor inconveniences. No, she was just getting started. One evening, I found a bright orange sticker slapped onto my driveway, announcing that my car, my perfectly registered, legally parked vehicle, was in violation of HOA parking regulations. The rule? A house could only have 2 cars parked in the driveway at any given time. I had 3, my car, my fiancée Emily's, and my brother's, who was staying with us while looking for an apartment. I checked the HOA bylaws. There was no such rule. I confronted Judith at the next community meeting. "That's odd," she said with an expression that could only be described as villainous serenity. Perhaps you were unaware of the recent amendment to our parking policy. As of last month, additional vehicles must be parked inside the garage. Can't just make up rules whenever you feel like it, I said. She blinked at me, the slow, calculated kind of blink that lets you know you're already losing. I assure you, all policies are voted on by the HOA board. It's not my fault. You didn't keep up. I looked around at the other HOA members, a mix of retirees and overworked parents too exhausted to argue. Some of them shifted uncomfortably, clearly unhappy but unwilling to go against Judith. That's when I saw it. A small smirk. She was enjoying this. That's when I decided, no more playing defense. If Judith wanted a fight, I'd give her one. The next week, I started documenting everything. Every petty fine, every altered rule, every suspicious complaint. I found others in the neighborhood who had been targeted. An elderly couple forced to repaint their house twice in a year. A single mom fined for leaving a stroller on her porch. A family threatened with legal action for putting up holiday decorations one day too early. Then, the bombshell. A neighbor tipped me off that Judith was running a private towing scheme. She had a deal with a local towing company to slap illegal boots on cars and split the profit. People had been paying hundreds to get their vehicles released, all under the pretense of HOA violations, and that's when I knew. It was time to take her down. But just when I thought I had her cornered, she made her next move. The next morning, I stepped outside to find all 3 of my cars booted, and a notice on my windshield. Your continued violations have resulted in immediate vehicle immobilization. Further infractions may lead to property liens. Property liens. She was threatening to take my house. I looked up at her window, and there she was, standing behind the glass, sipping her coffee. Smiling, I felt my pulse hammer against my skull. This wasn't just a flex of power, it was a declaration of war. I took a deep breath, forcing my hands to unclench. Losing my temper wouldn't get me anywhere. If Judith wanted to play dirty, fine. I just had to be smarter. I snapped pictures of the boots on my cars, the violation notice, the date, evidence. Then I knocked on my neighbor Greg's door. He was a retired cop, a guy who mowed his lawn every Tuesday like clockwork and occasionally brought over a six-pack when the Cowboys lost. He opened the door in his usual cargo shorts and a skeptical frown. "Judith?" he guessed before I even spoke. I nodded. "She booted my cars, threatened property liens." He whistled, shaking his head. "Damn, she's getting bolder." "So, I hear." I leaned against his doorframe. "You know she's been running a racket with the towing company, right?" Greg exhaled through his nose, rubbing his jaw. "Wouldn't surprise me. A lot of shady stuff started happening once she took over." I showed him my pictures. "Think this is legal?" "Hell no," he said, crossing his arms. "A homeowners association doesn't have the authority to boot cars on a public street. And liens? That's a scare tactic. She'd have to go through the courts." That was what I needed to hear. I spent the rest of the day knocking on doors. Judith had pissed off a lot of people. Families fined for imaginary violations, seniors harassed over minor infractions, a veteran threatened with foreclosure over his flagpole placement. The more I dug, the worse it got. Turns out, Judith had been quietly altering bylaws for months, slipping in obscure amendments that gave her more control over fines, enforcement, and, most importantly, where the money went. And a good chunk of that money had been misallocated to a company called Delacroix Compliance Services. Her own company. That's when it hit me. This wasn't just about power. It was a scam. But I still needed proof. That night, I waited until the neighborhood. Lights went out. Then, armed with a flashlight and a little righteous fury, I did something I hadn't done since high school. I broke into a filing cabinet. The HOA office was a converted storage unit behind the clubhouse, and it was laughably insecure. The lock? Cheap. The alarm system? Probably fake. I jimmied it open with a screwdriver, slipped inside, and started digging. What I found made my stomach flip. Judith had been siphoning HOA funds into her fake compliance company for years. Phony expenses, fabricated violations, fabricated charges, tens of thousands of dollars funneled directly into her personal accounts. And the towing company, also connected. Her nephew owned it. I took photos of everything, every fake invoice, every sketchy withdrawal, every forged signature. I had her, or so I thought. The next morning, just as I was preparing to send everything to the HOA board, the police showed up, for me. "Mr. Calloway," one of the officers said, voice flat. "We got a report of vandalism and unlawful entry." I froze. From who? Judith stepped out from behind them, a picture of smug satisfaction. "I saw him sneaking around last night," she said, pressing a hand to her chest, like the very thought of my existence exhausted her. I was so frightened. "He's been harassing me for weeks." The way she said it, like I was some unhinged lunatic, made my blood boil. The officer glanced between us. "Sir, do you have any reason to be in the HOA office after hours?" I clenched my jaw. If I admitted I had proof against her, she'd spin it. I needed to be careful. "I was retrieving documents regarding improper financial activity," I said evenly. Judith gasped theatrically. "You broke in to steal private HOA records?" Greg stepped onto his porch. "You've got to be kidding." "Me." Judith turned, face tightening. "This has nothing to do with you." Greg crossed his arms. "The hell it doesn't. I've been watching this circus for months." He looked at the officer. "You want to know what's really going on? Ask her about the bogus fines, the fake company she's running out of HOA funds, the illegal towing scam." Judith's face paled, but she recovered quickly. "These are baseless accusations," Greg scoffed. "Right, because you're real trustworthy." The officer shifted uncomfortably. Clearly, this wasn't the simple vandalism call he'd expected. Then another neighbor came outside. Then another. Soon, a small crowd had gathered, murmuring among themselves. Judith's control was slipping, and she knew it. "I have proof," I said. "Everything's documented." The officer sighed, clearly realizing he was in over his head. "All right. If you've got evidence, we'll need to take statements and look into it." Judith's composure cracked. You can't seriously be taking his word. But for the first time, she wasn't holding the reins. The crowd, the murmurs, the officers' uncertainty, it was all shifting against her, her lips pressed into a thin line. "Fine," she snapped. "I'll let the HOA board handle this internally." And just like that, she turned on her heel and stormed back inside. It wasn't a victory. Not yet, but I had rattled her. That night, I prepared to send my findings to every HOA member, every local news outlet, and, just for fun, the state attorney's office. I was ready to end this once and for all, but I never got the chance. Because at 3 a.m., my phone buzzed with a single text. "Unknown number. You should stop while you can." Then, a crash. I ran outside to find my mailbox in pieces. A brick lay in the wreckage, wrapped in a note. "Walk away." And just like that, I realized. Judith wasn't just a petty tyrant. She was dangerous. Here's the thrilling conclusion to your story. I stared at the brick, my pulse hammering. The message was clear: back down, or things would get worse. And that's when I made my decision. I wasn't backing down. If she wanted to play dirty, fine. I was done playing fair. The next morning I walked outside, coffee in hand, pretending I hadn't spent half the night installing security cameras. My mailbox was still in pieces, a monument to Judith's desperation. I didn't have to wait long. A sleek black SUV pulled up, and out stepped two men in khakis and polo shirts, the HOA's so-called compliance officers, aka Judith's, personal enforcers. One of them, a bald guy built like a refrigerator, held a clipboard with official violation notice stamped across the top. "Mr. Calloway, he said, flipping through the pages. "You've been issued a final warning for property damage." I raised an eyebrow. "You mean the damage caused by the brick someone threw at my house last night?" The guy didn't blink. "The HOA isn't responsible for vandalism." "No, but you are responsible for making up fake rules." I sipped my coffee. "And let me guess, you're here to tell me my lawn is still in violation? My cars are illegally parked? Maybe I blinked too aggressively and that's a fine now?" Judith's other enforcer, a lanky guy with nervous energy, cleared his throat. "Actually, you're being cited for hosting unauthorized gatherings." I frowned. "What gatherings?" Refrigerator guy motioned to the small group of neighbors standing in my driveway. Greg, the elderly couple from down the street. A few other victims of Judith's reign of terror. "The HOA considers any organized effort to oppose the board an unauthorized event," he said, reading off the clipboard. I let out a short laugh. "You're serious?" "It's in the bylaws," he replied. "New amendment." That was it. That was the moment I decided to go nuclear. I reached into my pocket and pulled out my phone. "Say that again." He blinked. I turned the screen toward him, showing the live icon. Streaming Judith's goons had just informed the entire neighborhood, and by extension the internet, that opposing their corrupt HOA was illegal. Lanky guy paled. "Wait, is that Liv?" "Oh yeah," I said, grinning. "Smile." Refrigerator guy yanked off his sunglasses. "You can't record us without permission." I tilted my head. "I'm standing on my property. And according to the very bylaws Judith loves so much, public officials of the HOA are subject to community transparency laws." Greg crossed his arms. "And HOA board members are technically public representatives under state law." Judith's muscle looked like their brains were short-circuiting. Lanky guy turned to his clipboard, desperately flipping through it. We need to check with Judith," I supplied. "Go ahead, call her." "Refrigerator?" Guy hesitated, but he didn't need to call her, because Judith was already on her way. She stormed out of her house like a queen marching into battle, wearing her signature pastel cardigan and a scowl so deep it could carve into concrete. "You have gone too far, Mr. Calloway." I gestured at my still-booted cars. "Funny, I was about to say the same to you." She pointed a manicured nail at me. "You are harassing the HOA. You're spreading lies. I have proof," I said, holding up my phone. "Want me to list it all? Because right now, about 300 people are watching this live, and I'd love for them to hear how you've been stealing from the HOA, illegally booting cars, and fabricating violations." Judith's expression flickered, just for a second, the first crack in her armor. Then she scoffed. "You think a silly little video is going to change anything? I am the HOA." And that's when the sirens started. 2 police cars rolled into the neighborhood, lights flashing. The moment they stopped, officers stepped out, one of them holding a folder thick with paperwork. "Judith Delacroix?" the officer called. She stiffened. "Yes? We have a warrant for your arrest." "You could have heard a pin drop." "What?" she choked out. The officer held up the papers. "Fraud, embezzlement, illegal business operations under a non-profit entity." Her mouth opened and closed like a fish gasping for air. "This is ridiculous. I am the president of the HOA, Ignai." Let out a low whistle. "Not anymore, you're not," the crowd murmured. Some people pulled out their phones, recording. Judith's face turned red, then purple. You can't do this," she shrieked. "This is harassment. I'll sue." "You all!" "Ma'am," the officer said, unimpressed. "Turn around." She tried to argue. She tried to rant. But in the end, none of it mattered, because they put her in cuffs. And the moment the squad car door shut behind her, the entire neighborhood cheered. The aftermath was swift and satisfying. The HOA board immediately held an emergency vote to dissolve Judith's amendments. The illegal towing scam shut down. The stolen HOA funds investigated and returned. The ridiculous fines. Voided. And Judith? She ended up facing multiple felony charges. Turns out, I wasn't the only one who had been digging. Greg had passed my evidence along to a buddy at the state attorney's office, and the HOA's shady finances were already on their radar. The police had just needed a final push. The best part? Her house went into foreclosure to pay off her legal fees. We replaced her with a new HOA president, someone who actually cared about the neighborhood instead of treating it like a personal kingdom. And while we still had rules, they actually made sense. For the first time in years, Maplewood Estates was a community again. And just when I thought it was over, a letter showed up in my mailbox. No return address. Inside was a single note, typed in all caps. "I'll be back." I smirked and tossed it in the trash. Because Judith? She wasn't coming back. Not to Maplewood, and not to my neighborhood.